Colleagues, let us start. I don't know, is it evening or afternoon? It should be evening now, right? Yes. And welcome to the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. We are glad to have you here. My name is Mfecane. I'm the director of the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. We are really pleased this evening to have Professor Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni, who agreed to come and talk about a very important subject on migration in Southeastern Africa. I was talking to my colleagues when the RSVPs came. There were fewer people who had RSVP'd, and I said, "Don't worry, we are going to have a full house," and I'm glad I was proven right. Sabelo, I'm sure, is known to most of you, but perhaps for some of you who do not know him, he is the professor at the University of South Africa and also a director of the Mfecane Institute. But he's also a visiting professor at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study for the whole of this year. You see, he's presenting here as part of the obligations of his visiting professorships. So he's paying for his lunch, so you can ask him as many questions as you want. I mean, I also want just to make one special welcome to the Singaporean ambassador to South Africa, who's sitting on my right here. As you know, JIAS is a joint institute between the University of Johannesburg and Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. I welcome your Excellency, glad that you're here. I really do not want to take a lot of time, just except to say one last thing, that the past few months have really been exciting. We've had so many lectures. People are complaining that we have a lecture and a seminar every day, sometimes two a day as it happened last week. We'll have another one tomorrow by one of the writing fellows. Then next week, actually, I think we'll have three more. One from the executive director of the World Academy of Sciences, who will be coming from Italy. Another one by an astronomer from the Northern Cape. And another one by one writing fellow sitting next to me. And they will be talking about race and racism in South Africa. So it is exciting times, and we promise to give you more exciting lectures in the future. Sabelo, I really do not want to take your time. We have an option you can give. You're here sitting there, or you can go stand there. It's up to you. Welcome to JIAS, and we are glad to have you here.
Sure. No, thank you so much, Dr. Nguni. And for protocol, I observed His Excellency the Ambassador, and all protocol observed. Maybe let me start this way. I'm no longer a historian. If there is anything called a former historian, then I will take that title. But what I'm talking about today is actually a historical issue. A historical issue with implications for the present. And perhaps to just open the presentation, I will speak to the paper. I won't actually read it. I think one of the things which I need to clarify from the beginning pertains to the topic itself. Nguni formations. It's a deliberate term to say Nguni formations. I could have said Nguni kingdoms. I could have said Nguni states. I could have said Nguni polities. But I was very careful in the choice of how I describe them. For the simple reason that one of the major problems when we deal with pre-colonial history is the question of using concept trans-historical, whereby you then talk about states, nations, citizens, taking from modernity flashing it back to a period where they never used those terms. So it's very important for us to be very careful what terminology, what concepts we use. Then the second major aspect of the topic is, of course, the Mfecane. The Mfecane being one of the hottest potatoes in Southern African history. Some think it never existed. Some think the term itself might be a problem. Then the third aspect of the topic is migration. So it's a three-part issues in this topic. My interest in it emanated from, I've seen people who are writing books and they tell people in that book that this is the book which I never wanted to write. And this is the paper which I never wanted to write. It's a paper which I was then invited out of the blue. Mahmoud Mamdani from Makerere University invited me to give a talk on this topic, and I told him, I'm a former historian, I'm not sure whether I will hang it properly. But after I've written it, I then became interested in it, and bearing in mind that by training I'm a historian, so it's really going back to my best discipline. But there are a number of issues which arises when we talk about Nguni formation, the Mfecane, and the migrations. The first one is the issue of identities. I think that will emerge identities here in Southeastern Africa. The second one is about conflict and violence. And I think that also is an important one in terms of the scale of the conflicts, the impact of the conflicts, and how, in quotation marks, pre-colonial conflicts being used to justify some of the things which are happening today. And the third one, related to migrations, is also the issue of the linkages between Southern Africa, Central Africa, and Eastern Africa. Because the Nguni formations, their impact goes up to Tanzania. So that's the... And I think because I've said something about the topic, I think it is also important that when we're dealing with a topic of this nature, one of the major issues which emerges, which also we need to take into account before we even move, is the issue of the colonial library. The colonial library, and how in the colonial library Africans are portrayed. And I think that is important. And that order of knowledge, if you use Modile's term, that order of knowledge, how does it actually present and describe Africans, and more particularly the Nguni. My own orientation is a very decolonial orientation, and that orientation leads me to make this statement. All human beings are born into valid and legitimate knowledge systems. And I'm saying this, it would be an unnecessary comment if it was not for the colonial library. It becomes very necessary within a context where the colonial library tried to then understand the other civilizations, other communities from a paradigm of difference. I think to start off, the first thing about the Nguni is the contested idea of the identity itself, the Nguni. And I don't want to then divert, because that needs its own later. But it's an important aspect to deal with. When did the people who are today called the Nguni, when did they become Nguni? Were they originally Nguni? When did they assume the term Nguni? The work of the historian John Wright, it actually argues that it is a very recent a collective name, which is attributed to the work of the missionary Alfred Wright. You know that old books, Old Times in Zulu and Natal, which was published in 1929. It is attributed to him that
he tended to popularize that idea, that collective name of the Nguni. And I must just say that today it is used to describe and designate various groups. The Xhosa speakers are part of the Nguni, the Zulu, the Nguni, the Swazi, the Nguni, the Shangans, the Nguni, the Ndebele, part of the Nguni, and the Ngoni, scattered in almost 5, if not 6 countries. In South Africa, of course, Swaziland, Malawi, Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania. So that's an important group, really, when we want to understand the history of Southeastern Africa. You will need to say something about them. And the question which then arises pertaining to the formation is, first of all, the issue of their origins. I think that would be important for us to reflect on that. And that reflection becomes very important in a context whereby there is a debate about who is indigenous in this country. I think that question becomes very, very important to say. The Nguni are part of Bantu-speaking people. And if you follow the discourse of the Bantu migrations, they are part of people who are said to have migrated from East Africa into Southern Africa. And they constitute what in archaeological terms we call the early Iron Age civilizations. And they become, in the name of the archaeologist Thomas Hoffman, the Nguni speakers form the largest division of the Eastern Bantu language in Southern Africa. That's what he says. And the idea from archaeological evidence, again, is that the Nguni are part of the Bantu, what is called the Bantu Keke complex civilization. The Bantu Keke complex civilization, what hung together that civilization is what we call a pastoral ideology. A pastoral ideology. And at the center of that pastoral ideology was the Keke economy. And this will be important as we move on to go back to it. They'll say they are actually part of a Bantu Keke complex civilization. At the center is a pastoral ideology, and that pastoral ideology privileges Keke keeping as part of the economy. I want to make two rather general statements. Analysis is always about making generalizations. One generalization which I want to make is that perhaps in order to understand Nguni history, you need to understand 2 epic migrations. 2 epic migrations. The one is the Bantu migration to the south. And then the second one is the migration to the north. So those are the 2 epic migrations, which I think, and we will need maybe to problematize the whole issue of migrations as we continue trying to make sense of the Nguni. But as I said, that at the center of the colonial library is a particular presentation of particular human beings. Some are presented as martial tribes, and some are presented as warriors. And once you're a warrior in the martial tribe, the term warrior, I tried to check the meaning. It fundamentally means somebody who is warring, somebody who really lives by war, if you like. And the intent is to say, because the warrior is bloodthirsty, sometimes there are no credible reasons why the person is fighting. It's just a way of life, just to live by fighting. And I think it is very important that we revisit that type of presentation of some human beings with a view to do what we call in decolonial studies, rehumanize. Because it then dehumanizes. It means these people just live like animals. They attack each other for no reason. They doubt whether, if we agree that they were human beings, they are people like that. So it's important that we speak about that. And the other thing which I need to be very clear from this beginning, when I'm talking about migration, I'm not talking about nomads. I think there are two terms which we need to be very clear. There is a term migration, then there is a term mobility. I think the correct term must be mobility. Mobility as a way of life. And the mobility enables us then to say, mobile people does not mean therefore that they never settle. They actually settle. They move, but they actually settle. In other words, what we want perhaps to draw quickly is the features of the Nguni societies. And already saying, in their life, there was the issue of mobility. There was also the issue of migration, but there was also the issue of settlement. So I'm not here creating, falling into the colonialist argument that they were just mobile people who claimed no territory. The Nguni actually were mobile, but at the same time they claimed territory. This summary then takes us to the region, the important region here, the Phongolo-Mzimkhulu region, which today covers present-day KwaZulu-Natal. That is the area which is said to have been populated by the majority of Nguni-speaking people. But it also begins to tell us that even prior to the so-called Mfecane, some people were already migrating out of Mzimkhulu Phongolo region. It is not clear what were the causes of the migrations, but you can, in the very who are now in Mpumalanga, they migrated from that region prior to the Mfecane. They did not move to that region because of the Mfecane. So if you begin to think that way, then you will find that the Mfecane then migrations become a third phase of migration. The first being the Bantu migrations. Then the second are migrations which took place between 1630 and 1670, prior to. Then the Mfecane becomes, and they always put it in quotation marks, I don't think that's the right term. Mfecane becomes then the migrations which happened under what is called Mfecane becomes a third form of migration. And if we say that, then it takes us to the key aspect of the debates. And those are the key aspects of the Mfecane debate. In the Mfecane debate, if we want to understand it, you need to perhaps think about two schools of thought, the conventional school and the revisionist school. And I will try to go through those very quickly, and then make my own input into it. The conventional view goes like this. It actually says, in the mid-19th century, there were cataclysmic changes which affected the region, which we call the Phongolo-Mzimkhulu region. And that is dated to the period 1810s to 1830s. That there were radical changes in that region. And that those radical changes are what ended up being called the Mfecane. The explanation of why there were those radical changes, and the radical changes manifesting themselves in terms of increased conflict, in terms of a little bit of bigger scale migration of people out of the region into the interior. The explanations are various. Some talk about climate change, some talk about explosion in population, Some talk about the rise of aggressive leaders, ambitious leaders, who pushed all others out of religion so that they remain there on their own. And that is that type of changes. The crisis was the crisis of naming. How do we name those changes? Some, you know, when you say it's time of troubles, I don't think that is very analytical. There are so many time of troubles in people's lives. Actually saying what was happening then was time of troubles, and then as though before and after there was nothing like that. I don't think that concept is very useful. The second one is to then identify one leader, and they say the rise of this leader was the cause of all the movements inheriting. I think also that is very problematic. But what that argument says is that the leader acted this way, then he provoked a chain reaction. That is what the conventional historiography tells us. And then it also says that the changes were not only about migration and conflict, but they were also institutional changes. Institutional changes in terms of some of the institutions which were used for particular purpose changed purpose during that time. And one of them, of course, being the Amabuto institution, which was a unit of production and with other purposes, but during that period, it assumed more and more a militaristic purpose. That is what it then tells us. And I will try to, I think the best summary of that view comes from its critic, Julian Copley, who then says, after 1790, he's giving a summary of the conventional view. After 1790, a self-generated internal revolution occurred within the northern Nguni societies to the southwest of the Delaware Bay, and this culminated in the Shagain military revolution at the turn of the 1820s. The consequent Zulu expansion had a near genocidal effect and precipitated a series of destructive migrations into the interior. People as far as Lake Nyanza in Victoria were scattered by the playout of chain reactions initiated by Chaka. Instantly, Zulu-ized first migrations, such as the Ndebele and the Nguni, set in motion peoples further inland. In combination, they extensively depopulated the future white areas of Transvaal, Orange Free State, Natal, a process which accounts for the general distribution of white and Bantu land ownership in South Africa. Shaka became the explanation for everything. That is the summary of the conventional view. There were attempts in the 1960s to revise and also to re-articulate the events. And one of the key texts, when I went to school, that was the key text, is by John Omakupa, The Zulu Aftermath, a 19th century Bantu revolution. And if you want to understand Omakupa's arguments, you need to understand the Ibadan School of History. John Omakupa was actually part of that Ibadan School of History. And the core aspect of the Ibadan School of History was this. It was the attempt to capture what is called the African fact in human history. It was, today we will speak about, by then they were talking about it in terms of African factor. Today we will talk about African agents in history. And the Omakupa was trying to actually say, you remember the debate at Ibadan was the issue whether colonialism was a mere episode in African history. And the idea was that Africans had a longer history prior to colonialism. And they were trying to say what actually happened in Southeastern Africa, according to Omakupa, was then appraised positively. And he actually named it as a revolution in Bantu Africa. And he went on to say the key features are actually state formation and nation building. And he went on to say the key features are also the rise of very capable leaders. Mzilikazi, Soshangane, Zwangendaba, they are all credited as very creative, very original leaders, as part and parcel of what in the 1960s was a nationalist historiography, as a counter to colonial historiography. But what Cooper did not actually challenge is this issue of the causes of the Mfecane and the Mfecane idea of the Mfecane itself. He actually re-articulated it in nationalist terms, but he never challenged its core tenets of blaming Shaka and the Zulu for causing the Mfecane. And if we go to the depth of the debates, I think there is a consensus that there were indeed radical changes which took place. No historian is doubting that there were changes which took place around from 1810 up to the 1830s. The crux of the problem is what were the causes. So the consensus that there were changes which took place, there is that consensus. Whether we are revisionists, whether we are conventional historian, there is still that agreement that indeed there were changes. But what we need, what we are not agreed on, is what were the causes. And that's when there is the rise of the revisionist school, led, of course, by Julian Coppin, a historian who was based at Rhodes University. I'm not sure whether he's still there. He was very bold to challenge the issue of the Zulu aftermath. That the Mfecane is actually a Zulu aftermath. And he did that at a time in the 1990s, in the late 80s and 1990s. And one of his major publication challenging the conventional historiography is an article entitled "The Mfecane as Alibi: Thoughts on Gitakong and Mbolombo," which you find in Journal of African History, 1988, where he set out to really, in a radical form, revise the whole thesis of the Mfecane. Coppin posited that the motor for change was not a self-generated internal revolution with a short time scale, but rather European penetration against which black societies throw up a series of complex reactions that matured over a longer period of time, before and after the irrelevantly truncated Mfecane era. And it is important that I share with you the conclusion of Coppin, which is very important, which is central for the revisionist scholarship. He says, the Mfecane is a characteristic product of South African liberal history, used by apartheid state to legitimate South Africa's racially unequal land division. Some astonishingly selective use of actually the invention of evidence produced by the myth of internally induced process of black-on-black destruction centering on Chaka Zulu. A re-examination of the battles of Gitakong and Mbolombo suggests very different conclusions, and it enables us to decipher the motives of subsequent historiographical amnesias. After about 1810, the black people of Southern Africa were caught between intensifying and converging imperialist thrusts. One to supply Cape Colony with labor, another at Delagoya to supply slaves, particularly to the Brazilian sugar plantations. The flight of the Nguni from Mzinyatini inland to the Caledon was, it is argued, a response to slavery. But they ran directly into the colonial raiding grounds north of the Orange. In short, African societies did not generate the regional violence on their own. Rather, caught within the European net, they were transformed over a lengthy period in reaction to the attentions of external planters. The core misrepresentation of the Mfecane are thereby revealed. The term and the concept should be abandoned. That is Coppin. What are the implications of this? The first implication, it provokes us to then question whether the Mfecane was really a pre-colonial event. That's the first. That's the first implication. What about if we see the Mfecane as part of the unfolding of mercantilism and the colonial encounters? And it has other broader implications, particularly for the history of Southern Africa. Where do you draw a line that this is pre-colonial? That is one question which is important for us. Where do you draw the line? This is where the pre-colonial end, this is where the colonial starts. And I will try to draw some epochs which I think they help us to then understand what copying is saying in a better way. The second implication which comes from copying is saying Shaka and the Zulu are a product of the changes, not a cause. They are a product of the changes of 1810s, not a cause. And he boldly says the cause then is the European encirclement complex. And we need to unpack what that encirclement was, so that we put content to the arguments. I tried to summarize the periods of the mercantilism and the colonial counters into 4 periods, which I think we need to think about carefully. The first epoch, I called it 1488 to 1652. And you know what happened in 1488? The circumnavigation of the Cape by Bartholomew Dias. You know what happened in 1498? Vasco da Gama successfully reached the East Indies. And you know what happened in 1652? Jan van Riebeeck arriving here. And I'm trying to say, if we want to understand the mercantilist period, we can't start in 1652, we need to go to 1488. Because the first encounters with the Khoi actually predates 1652. And I want us to then try to draw and understand what is called the unfolding colonial moving frontier. The second phase, which I think is important for us, for purposes of analysis, because they overlap, is the 1652 to 1795. And this period covers the colonization of the Cape by the Dutch, particularly the rule of the mercantilist Dutch East India Company, and the unfolding of a violent moving frontier, conquering, dispossessing, enslaving, and displacing indigenous people. Then 1795 to 1820. In 1795, the British occupied a strategic wartime naval base in the course of the Napoleonic Wars. In 1806, the British took over the Cape Colony, and in 1820, we know the 1820 white settlers who arrived in that part of Britain. The people who are said to be the cause of the Mfecane, Shaka, Mzilikazi, and many others, when were they born? Let's not talk about even their activities. When were they born? If you follow this periodization which I'm trying to draw, you will see that Shaka and Mzilikazi, they are actually born in the second phase, between 1652 and 1795. And that is the height of the age of mercantilism. If you read the literature on mercantilism elsewhere and everywhere, it is said to be a period of violence, banditry, and enslavement. And it is not surprising that what we see here between 1810 and the 1830s also mirrors that period of banditry, conflict, and enslavement. If we continue with that type of analysis, then we will say, what about 1810 I'm sorry, 1820 to 1910. What is happening in between that period? And if you take into account this 4-5 periodization, then you will begin to locate the Mfecane not as a pre-colonial event, but as an event of a colonial encounter. That's what I would posit. And then, when you come now to mapping the theaters of violence, after we've done that one in terms of time, you need then also to draw the theaters of violence. Of course, they tell us that the Pongolo-Mzimkhulu region was one theater of violence. But Coppin tells us that there is something which we need to understand, the encirclement complex. And what were the axes of the encirclement complex? I want to add to that, one axis was the Delaware Bay, with the Portuguese there. The second axis was Port Natal. The third axis was the Caledon Valley. The fourth axis was the Cape Colony. And if you understand that, then you can now draw to say what was the pressure which led people to fight in the coastal area. And what is the pressure which led people to move from the coastal areas across the Drakensberg Mountains into the highveld. I think it is important to then say, what was this pressure which pushed people out? This is not to exonerate the Africans and the black people, but to actually say, when you are talking historically, you can't just ignore other actors who are acting at the same period, and then you isolate one, and you say it was only Chaga who was the cause of the violence. You mean all these other people who were in Delaware Bay, who were in the Cape, who were in Port Natal, they were just there as spectators when people were killing each other. So that's what I'm trying to draw from the work of Coppin, this developing European encirclement complex. And I did a full paper on this, which I will share, where I tried to draw this issue of the development of the European encirclement complex. Of course, I've already said that at the Delaware Bay were the Portuguese, in Port Natal were both the British and the Boers. In the Caledon Valley, the interesting part about Caledon Valley is that the issue is that when people were fighting in the Pongolo-Mzimkhulu region, they crossed the Drakensberg Mountains, they move into the interior, which is the Caledon Valley in the interior. And what is it that they found there, which intensified the conflicts? According to the conventional historiography, is that the people were moving across the Drakensberg Mountain, they were carrying violence into the interior. They actually carried the violence into the interior. And that actually raises a number of arguments. Some statistical, the argument that King Shaka killed almost 2 million people using a spear. And that Mzilikazi killed almost equal number of people using a spear. And when you are thinking deeply about the pre-colonial social formations, you need to also think about their offensive capacity, the military offensive capacity. The military offensive capacity of a people using a short stepping spear, even to kill 500 people, is impossible. That's one possible way of thinking about it. The second way of thinking about it is this one. What was the purpose of pre-colonial warfare? I think that is also an important aspect of it. What was the purpose of pre-colonial warfare? Was it to annihilate other people? From my reading, it will seem pre-colonial, the logic of pre-colonial warfare, people were valued, cattle were valued. A successful war is to bring more people rather than to kill more. That's That's what is emerging from the literature. That the more you bring people, the more you bring cattle, the stature of a king depended on the number of people under you. It never depended on how many people you killed. With that in mind, then I move to the last part of the presentation, which is now the migrations. I said there is a consensus that there were conflicts, that there were wars. The problem is, what were the causes? So it means, therefore, the issue that people migrated is a historical fact. People migrated. What is still the subject of debate is what were the causes. And I will talk about maybe two examples of people who migrated. One of them is the most important one for a number of reasons. The migration of Soshana and the establishment of the Gaza Kingdom. So disappointing to read about Soshana and the Gaza Kingdom. The material is very, very thin. Perhaps the thinness of the material also emanates from the idea that he then went to the Delaware Bay, where the material is in Portuguese. Maybe those who read Portuguese can actually then read the material. But when I tried to read from the English perspective, it's very hard to get really a full story of Soshana and Nguni. What emerges clear is that he was part of the Ndwandwe of Zwide, part of the ruling class there. The second issue which emerges is that when Zwide was then defeated by King Chaka in 1818, the kingdom tended to fragment, and it was very common for kingdoms to fragment after the defeat. And he was one of the people, fragments, which then migrated into the Delaware Bay to establish the Gaza kingdom there. But when they moved into Delaware Bay, he never moved alone. Zwangendaba also moved into that space. Another one, Mfecane, also moved into that space. The other one, Masebo, also moved into that space. And when they moved into that space, they began to fight among themselves. Of course, others moved out, and the Gaza kingdom then remained there for some time. Even it succeeded to the death of Soshana. He died in 1858, but the kingdom actually lived up until 1895, when they were colonized by the Portuguese. The interesting part is that these kingdoms, the methods of building the kingdoms, this is where it has implications for the present. They tended really to be very accommodative of strangers. They were very flexible in terms of rebuilding their identities and expanding them. And that's why I still believe that the warfare was never about killing. But the most epic is the history of Gatsheni, who also was part of the Ndwandwe of Zwide. And this one is very interesting in the sense that Zwangendaba's migration takes almost 20 years. And it covers about 5 countries and 3 regions. South Africa, Mozambique, Swaziland, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia, and Tanzania. If you read the history, you can actually say he was a very fantastic leader, surviving, keeping the people together for over 20 years. But there is another argument. It says the very fact that he moved that far, it means there was some weakness. He could not keep territory. So he could be pushed out. That's another part of it. But what is important about him is that he moved into the Delaware Bay area. And due to clashes there, he moved to Swaziland. He was in Swaziland for 2 years. Again, he moved from Swaziland to Zimbabwe. He crossed the Zambezi River in 1835 into Malawi. Stayed in Malawi for a long period of time. And it is in Malawi that you have the longest history of Zwanenda. But I want to explain something about his stay in Swaziland. It is said that when he stayed in Swaziland, he had 2 houses. And when we are talking about 2 houses, we are talking about the marriage, the wives. He had two houses, the senior house and the junior house. And the pre-colonial history, that's where terminology becomes very important. Pre-colonial history, some things are spoken about in terms of metaphors, which must not be taken literally. It is said that one of the senior wives then offered them beer, but it in a boat, what we call a car, we call it calabash. Yes. And it was not closed. And it offended the king. The other part says they found a piece of hair in the beer. And then it looks like there was suspicion of what we call witchcraft. Some, they say that is a metaphor for promiscuity. So, what happened is that it is said that Zwanenda then demoted the senior house into a junior house. And they elevated the junior house into a senior. And it has implications, political implications. Political implications being the succession. That the heir always needed to come from the senior house. But if you then change, and when he did the change, it was only known by senior people with him that very day. The bigger population did not know what happened. And it has implications when they were now in Malawi, when he died. When he died, that event which happened in Swaziland came to haunt the Nguni in Malawi. The generality of the followers of Zwanenda, where they knew the senior house as this one, and they didn't know the devotion. So they expected the son from that house to succeed. But those who were closer, they were saying, no, but this was changed. It was changed in Swaziland. So the person from the junior house is now the successor. And the nation actually split into 5 fragments because of that. The sons led different fragments. And that's how they then have another movement from Malawi into Zambia. And the other 2 groups moved into Tanzania. I'm actually summarizing a very complex history. A very complex history. But before Zwanenda died, it is said that he already had an intention to go to Tanzania. His forces had raided into Tanzania. And you know this cows with the long horns. It is said that they brought those cows with the long horns from Tanzania. And then the king was so happy that he said, let's move and go in the circle there, where there are these beautiful pigs. Unfortunately, he died before he realized that. And the conclusions which I'm trying then to draw from these stories and the histories is that when I went to Makerere University, there is a history which needs to be written about the Nguni who are actually in East Africa. And those Nguni, they tended then to intermingle with another tradition, the Arab Swahili tradition, producing what is called the Ruga Ruga. It needs really another research from that end. I'm not very competent at the moment to say much about it, but there is evidence that they ended up there. Which fundamentally means that the story which starts in the Kongolo, Muzikulu, it ends up there in Tanzania, covering Southern Africa, Central Africa, into East Africa. And the interesting part, when I was speaking at Makerere, Somebody said, I saw some people in Kenya who actually claim to be Nguni. But there's something very interesting about how this name, people still call themselves that. In reality, as they move over a period of 20 years, they were integrating more and more non-Nguni people. One of the sons of Zwangenda was called Mbelo, who was born in Malawi. And Mbelo, he was named Mbelo because the people whom he had moved with from South Africa, they became old when they reached that age, and they died in numbers because of old age. So it was called Mbelo, and that's where they were buried, most of them. So the son was called Mbelo. So it means most of the people who call themselves Nguni wherever they are, they might actually be over other ethnic groups. And it then takes us to say, what does Nguniness mean? Because they are Nguni, and you cannot doubt it. They were integrated into Nguni culture, and they believe that they are Nguni. And that's how they want to be understood, wherever they are. And I think what is emerging poignantly from what I've said is the issue of, we need to think carefully about the issue of mobility, settlement, and migration. It does not mean that the people, when you talk about migration, mobility, and the settlement, they are then talking about nomadic people. You know, in colonial historiography, they will come up with this idea that, yeah, but the areas outside Europe were empty. And if they were not empty, the people were there were nomadic. In other words, they did not claim over land and the territory. That's what colonial historiography says. The other important point which actually emerges here, if you read the Nguni histories more closely, is that the exaggeration of the violence is defeated by the evidence on the ground. The evidence on the ground actually proves that in the pre-colonial, it was impossible to commit a genocide. It was almost impossible. If ever you have genocidal impulses or genocidal tendencies, people just abandon you because because there were no borders. We were actually debating this with the Prof. Mahmoud Mamdani. Mahmoud Mamdani says, but you say it with a stepping speed, you cannot kill 3 million people. I've studied a genocide in Rwanda, where they were using machete, and they killed how many millions? No. Then I said, yeah, so then I said to him, Prof, what we are missing is this one. Those people were not going to die if there were no boundaries. They could have moved. But the problem is the boundaries, the iron cages of boundaries. That's the one which makes it very possible for a genocide to take place. Then the way they ended up in Zimbabwe, whenever there is a possibility that you'll be annihilated by somebody, you just leave. So it's that one point which I wanted to highlight. And the other issue is the issue of, you know, today, the more people who come to your space, the more they become a problem. In the pre-colonial, it was not like that. The more people you attract, the bigger you are as a king. And the question is, when did it happen that people become a problem rather than an asset? When did people become consumers? They are coming to eat, they are coming to do this. There is no other argument about them contributing to anything. The final point which I wanted to say also is that whenever we're thinking about the 1820s, 1810s, we need to rethink our periodization of what is pre-colonial and what is colonial. And I think that will actually then answer the question of what exactly was the Mfecane. I think the Mfecane actually sits at the center of colonial encounters It's not a pre-colonial debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sabelo. We'll open it up for questions, comments. I'll start with you, Jody, and with you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor. My name is Jody. I teach at the University of Burundi.
Sure.
So I was very drawn to your abstract, and I'm glad that you did finally make it into the Great Lakes region by the end of your talk. And I would say, this is in general, in my experience the last couple of months in South Africa, is I would encourage you to venture into the other regions farther, and not to say that, you know, this story of looking up the coast of Tanzania needs to be studied from the other end. It needs to be studied from both ends. Yeah. And if you need to learn Swahili or Portuguese, learn them. This is what we do as scholars. And by the way, there's a clan in eastern Burundi on the border with Tanzania called the Abazulu. And they say that they are the descendants of Shaga's warriors. Now, I don't know when they started attaching Shaga's name to that, who had migrated north. As I listen to you, so I'm very interested in this sense of mass killing, which is a modern Western phenomenon. And it can take the form of genocide, it can take the form of the slave trade, and I think this was imported to and imposed upon the continent, but is now being implemented by Africans. I would be interested in hearing you talk a little more about, say, the difference between court cultures in pre-colonial Africa, and say the general moral philosophy of a people, which is to say that people are an asset and we just bring them in, and I know values say in Burundi and Rwanda are that a refugee must be welcomed, even an animal that takes refuge, and there are stories and parables about it. Whereas court cultures do tend to be, like the story you told about Nzilikazi and the demotion, about extirpating whole clans, right? That does happen in a court culture. And I think some of those cultures, that this certainly happened in Burundi in early independence, that then get projected onto a new nation, there is a pre-colonial practice, I would say, that can be blown up into genocide, and that comes from one faction or one clan wanting to wipe out another clan, or one junior or senior house wanting to overcome another, but it's very much a function of court politics and not of the larger formation. And as you say, in the pre-colonial times when that got really bad, people just said, we're not going to follow you anymore, right? We're not going to follow you into genocide. Or, you know, Shaga's aunt takes care of him so that the people don't suffer. But I don't know, would you have more examples of what you were describing?
Sure.
Because where a certain kind of elite infighting, which is, again, what is mostly responsible for genocide in contemporary Africa.
Maybe let me take about 3 or so.
Yes.
It's George Mahashe. My question is, it's more of a comment, and I'm really attracted to how you summarize the debate of the Mfecane, because that kind of debate doesn't really get enough public attention. What's interesting for me is to ask what would it mean if you had to include the figure of Mujaji. Not just the queen as we know her today, but the Mujaji as an office that predates the current queen. So for example, you cannot talk about Shaga's movement without talking about his relationship with Mujaji. But again, Mujaji is a difficult figure because she appears as a myth, right? But for me, I really would want to know what does it mean to rethink this whole theater that you've just put in the 1810, 1820s, with the figure of Mujaji as a very particular figure within this theater.
Sure.
And it's a question I ask as I run, but I think for me, I really was very attracted to how you have had this debate before, but how you've put it on the table, it's quite encouraging, and I would like to hear it with that figure, filtered into the grand scheme.
Sure. The Queen Mjaji one, I must actually express my ignorance about but the centrality in that history. Maybe
Zulu, they call him Mabele Mate.
Maybe you need to elaborate more on that one. But the other one, when I'm saying there is no possibility of genocide, I'm not ruling out intentionality. I'm talking about possibility because of the openness. I think the examples are many of people who migrate when one leader becomes too powerful, becomes too threatening. Even what I was describing about the Ndwandwe kingdom. One explanation is that because of the defeat by Changa, they then fragmented. The other is that there were already misunderstandings within the community, which led to people like Uzongendaba to move, people like Soshanani to move. So when I was reading those type of movements, that's when I said, it looks like it was almost difficult to commit a genocide. People, they collect their relatives, those who follow them, and they move away. They move away. Even avoiding the possible genocide of the colonial encounters. When there were no boundaries, people would move. And the example of the Ndebele when they were now down in the Caledon Valley, and the Boers were now migrating from the Cape into the space. They resisted it, Verkoop, they resisted Moseha, they resisted it many times. But when they saw that it was difficult to resist, they just crossed the Limpopo River into what is today's Zimbabwe. So there are a number of examples which indicates that it was very difficult to. When the Ndebele were actually that side of Zimbabwe, between 1840 and 1841, again there was a possibility of a civil war inside. Some came back to South Africa. They just decided, if it is like this, then we better go back. So it's those movements which led me to make that conclusion. But when you finish the judge, let's talk about it. I need to follow up.
Another round. Questions? Yes.
There's a bit of pressure on me, but I think my question was you are kind of allocating more people, but that's fine. So, Prof, at your prelude, you mentioned the usage of concepts post and pre-colonization. Mine, it's allow me to be a bit generic.
Sure.
I think university systems which were almost reliant on for sort of gathering knowledge could be a culprit of usage of concepts that are out of context. That means even the framework, the lenses we're all using here might also be problematic.
Sure.
And then we call each other scholars and so forth. I'm just wondering, useful as the system could be, what are the implications of this system in terms of the context of the continent? Because in my reading, you're saying what misread people, misrepresented, and oftentimes kind of like isolated. And that's, I think I'm using university as a common example. What is your take on that?
Sure. There's another one.
Thank you for the presentation. I may have missed what I'm going to ask because I was a bit late.
Sure.
I'm interested in establishing who gave this event or whatever it is, the name Mfecane and Mfecane. Because that could be a clue about who was looking from somewhere, either inside or outside, and gave it this name. And what do these names mean to those linguistic groups? That's the beginning for me, because you don't find this with any English name or any other language, but these two. Secondly, I'm not sure I would understand clearly the explanation that Zwangendaba migrated through 5 countries. Were those countries there at the time?
Yeah.
There's always a problem with seeing things with today's eyes. Because in the same breath you say there were no borders. So I would be more comfortable if you say he went across so many mountains and crossed so many rivers, rather than borders that were not there. This argument that there may have been other nationalities or groups from outside Africa that fueled this movement or whatever else that accompanied it. It's not the first time that it comes up. It is in some journal, a British journal, I think. And it also includes an explanation that there was also slavery and many other factors, environmental, so social, economic, political, cultural factors. There should be a holistic attempt to explain this whole thing. But lastly, it's interesting that as we discuss the Mfecane whatever, which is concentrated around Delagoa Bay and then you move up, what of this theory that the Ngunis come from the north? Because this has serious implications for today's challenges that our government is trying to resolve. The issue of land, the issue of who is the first nation and who should get what in order to bring about equality. So this discussion is very rich, but then it must be comparative, as comparative as possible, so that we get to get broader and deeper understanding of what happened, so that we can, in our attempt to level the playing ground, be very close to reality. Thanks.
Yeah.
No, thanks. Firstly, you indicated there are significant events that predate 1652. And what makes 1652 significant was the fact that there was a mass settlement and it grew and it advanced in what is called the Eastern Frontier. So if we use the idea that massacres and genocide were not necessarily possible because people could move, why then did those in the so-called Eastern Frontier not move, not cross Muslim Kulu up north? Because they remained there, they were dispossessed. Both the Khoi and the San, as well as the Xhosa, there were no mass migration. Secondly, if you can explain something about Sopos, the Swati, I mean, how do they then survive just a stone throw away across the Pongwal, and they survive and establish a kingdom there when Shaka and his successors were across the river literally. In fact, at the time there are claims that even Pomolo River was part of Swaziland, as it were. And this theme of genocides, there have been excavations, especially from the 18th century and beyond, and out of colonial curiosity and later some advances in science. And these excavations have found Homo naledi and Bigfoot. They are not finding mass graves. So if there were million people who were killed, surely as they were exploring for gold and diamonds and Homo naledi, they must have discovered mass graves somewhere. Or maybe in another century they will find those mass graves. And lastly, then the issue of, in this word I can't pronounce it, but proletarianization of the Nguni. I mean, how does it then, affect migration or movement, as it were, especially in the mid to late 19th century, and the impact it had then on how people were moving between, let's call them borders for the purpose of this discussion.
Sure, let me not answer, let me respond. I think again, what I started with, the issue of concepts becomes, I knew it was going to come. The issue of concepts, the use of modern terms to project into a particular period. I think that's an important issue which we need to be honest about. A person like myself, and almost all people who are in this room, produced by the modern university system, they speak a particular modern language. And that particular modern language has a tendency to distort people who lived in a different era. And we debated this. When I presented this, Prof. Momdani was actually the discussant. So she came really hard on me on concept and terminology. But as he was doing that critique, he also fell into the same problem. When he began to speak about peasants, when he began to speak about slavery. So I said, it looks like we're caught up in the same problem. It's an important question you are raising about concepts. But for a person like me and you, we will need to learn to unlearn so many other things in order to actually speak almost in error to what people understood themselves as. Because the simplest thing is in the Ndebele state, Zulu nation, all those are modernistic concepts which we then flash back into a period where they might not have used those terms. But I have tried to scratch my head. I find it very difficult. And what I found in Mamdani's space is that he tries to push all the doctoral and the postdoctoral students to come up with new concepts. But what I saw happening was that they then fall into another problem. The problem of vernacularization. Where you just name something in the vernacular and then you think we have developed another concept. that I also found might be a problem. You can go around naming it in isiZulu, in isiXhosa, and all this, but still the logic in your mind is still a modernistic one. So that one, I think we need more time to really think about the constitution of the political, say, in the pre-colonial, how did it work, and how can we wring ourselves out of misrepresentations and the misnaming.
in terms of Mfecane, earlier on, Eric Walker was credited for having coined the term Mfecane in 1928. But there is an article which was written recently by a person who has spoken here, Professor Ndlovu-Gatsheni, which actually uses vernacular published material, which traces it to the 1860s or whatever. That there was another black person who actually used the term Mfecane prior to 1928. But what is not coming out clearly there is, what does it mean? In isiZulu, what does it mean? They are saying Mfecane then describes Mfecane among the Sototswana. Mfecane then describes it among the Nguni. But it's not very clear what. That's why I was saying, to just say it's a time of trouble. As Professor Ndlovu is saying, the problems which were happening from the eastern part, the moving frontier and the killings, why is it not called Mfecane if Mfecane means a time of trouble? Over 100 years, people have been trying to resist the Dutch-British moving frontier, which was even more violent than what was coming from Pongolo, Muzimkulu region. Why didn't they call that Mfecane if Mfecane just means a time of trouble? So there's something very, very important about naming, and I don't know how we can deal with it. And my issue is to bring it here so that we begin to think about it. Because the trap is to use modernist terms which develop in a particular moment of history, and then you use it transhistorically. It tends to distort what is happening, what's happening in that. And you are right, in the eastern frontier, of course, at the Sen and the Khoi, they seem to have been exposed to a form of genocide. But I hope when I started, I spoke about the offensive capacity of some societies. And these other ones, they were arms with firearms. They were using horses. They were using a different format. There was a name for it, the commando. The commando formation, whereby you hunt for other people with the purpose to kill them, which in the northern Nguni, southern Nguni, I don't see the traces of people really arming themselves to hunt for other people in order to kill them. So it's a different ball game altogether. The interest in this project, maybe I must also give this background. 2 years ago, there was a suggestion that we do a broader project on migrations. And the idea was that we do about 4 layers of migrations. It arises from what you're asking about productization. It was that we do what they called Ndwandwe dispersal. That was the term. Ndwandwe dispersal, which covers the so-called pre-colonial migrations out of this space somewhere else. Then the second phase does a second layer of migration named labor migrations from the Malawi back into this space after the discovery of gold and diamonds. And that's where the whole question of then productization then emerges. Then there is a third layer of migrations. Again, people migrating from here into the region and the continent as a result of the impact of the apartheid repression. People going into exile in Zambia and many other parts. Then there is a last phase of migration. I don't know how to describe this one. After 1994, when the people then come again. And the issue was that perhaps if we do that, then we will understand the complexity of the issues which are troubling us today. And this research, I'm participating in it from the perspective of research in Ndebele. There are other historians from Mozambique, from the other parts of up to East Africa, who are doing other groups. And hopefully they will bring some interesting insights. I can't even claim to have exhausted the migration of Zongendaba. This is really preliminary research. It needs really more work. Because I don't want to leave you with an impression that he was just moving like that. It's not like that. He was settling in many places. For years, then he moves. For years, then he moves. And when I presented in East Africa, they had asked me to do what is called Nguni diasporas. Another term which is very problematic. That those are Nguni diasporas. And the idea was that those people who are in Malawi, who are in Mozambique today, who are in East Africa are actually part of Nguni diasporas. So I was saying, but the idea of a diaspora is connected to the idea of a home, a singular home. What about people who migrate many times? Where is their homes? So the home it becomes really complex for historians, particularly who are concerned about nuances. I think to use the diaspora would be very problematic. What was the other thing? Well, the other issue, Musani raising this whole issue. I think the other type of research which we need to reflect on, particularly when it comes to the question of land, the archaeological evidence and the historical evidence. The archaeological evidence tells us something else. The historical evidence tells us something else. The archaeological evidence will tell you the earliest civilization of Mapungubwe dates back to 12th century. Then somebody tells you that, but the one who came in the 17th century. So there is all that discrepancy. You are talking about archaeological research on hominids, which actually makes South Africa a cradle of humankind, if you follow these other discoveries from archaeology. Which then raises the question whether people emerged here, then moved to the east, then came back in the 17th century concurrently with the others. I'm not sure. But that is the argument which then raises this perennial debate on empty lands. And the idea of empty lands is not a South African problem. It's a colonial history problem. Go to Australia, they say the same thing. The idea that lands outside Europe were empty. And the problem with thinking it from a decolonial perspective is the imperviousness of the proponents of that argument to evidence. How much evidence you give, they reproduce it. How much evidence you give, they reproduce it. So it's a very tiring debate because you can offer as much evidence as you want, but after some time people revive that debate of empty lands again.
Any other question? Coming towards 7, and we'll try to end these talks at 7 o'clock. Any other question, colleagues? Or maybe I should throw in my...
Sure.
I mean, first of all, it's conceptual. So if it is not a nation, a state, an ethnic group, all these categories that we get taught at school and at university, what is it then? Because I don't think it is enough to say it is not this. We have to think about what we call it.
Sure.
Especially because the dominant terminology are these concepts and what it goes to. in your paper we have called it, for instance, Nguni formations. Nguni formations without a name or Nguni formations still to be named. I think we need to think a bit in our conceptualization, what are we to call this? You gave us two concepts, migration, mobility, and expressed the preference for mobility. I'm interested in the preference, what informs that and what are the implications of that preference. Because we've put it on the table. There's the first set of questions which are conceptual. There are other questions that have to deal with historical evidence that I think we need to think about as the next step. It is one thing to dispute something. I think the obligation, perhaps sometimes the obligation is to say then, if it is not this, what it is. I want to use this about the empty land thesis, because it is a big issue in South Africa today. I spend a lot of time checking the website of something called AfriForum. Perhaps I spend more time than I should actually, but I check them literally every day. I mean, and they have a long report, actually an extensive report on land ownership patterns in South Africa. Where, I mean, I think the argument is that literally 60% of the land of what is called South Africa today was empty. And they have evidence to back up that. I mean, they even come up with maps. They say this was empty, here it was empty.
As if they were there.
Literally, Transvaal, I think 70%, if not more, of Transvaal, it was empty. Now, of course, I mean, we laugh at this, I mean, but I think if we have a different view, I think we have an obligation to come up with historical evidence. It is not enough, in my view, to say, no, it was not empty. Then, if it was not empty, show us evidence that it was not empty then. Because it's just not for scholarship's sake. It has become such a hugely political issue in South Africa today. I mean, if you check their submission to that committee in Parliament that deals with expropriation of land without compensation, most of their submission was based on the thesis of the empty land in South Africa. So I'm just saying, it's a great paper, but I think we do need to deal with conceptual issues. If it is not a nation, it's not a state, what is it then? Formation, good, but I think we need to take it a step further collectively. I'm not saying it's your responsibility alone, but we also need to deal with the issue of historical evidence. It's one thing to say this was not the case, what was it then? And we have an obligation as scholars who work on these things. Does any person have a question? I say I've provoked people. Yes.
Yeah, but then to pressure you in terms of evidence, epistemologically, that history, evidence in terms of history, who invented it in the form of an inscription that I'm writing history, in a sense that we will have sources. You find that, okay, it comes from generals. Columbus was sitting on the rock and he said, I discovered people. I mean, even the history of cartography, the history of mapmaking, that I saw the report very little from where I'm coming from. And I think the crisis that we are caught with is that we are worshipping at the altar of false evidence. False in the sense that we don't question what is the source of that evidence. We are more concerned with the symptomatic, like that, oh, it is there, it is presented. And also, when they are saying that this is historical evidence, I'm prioritizing also the issue of the archive. Where were black people there, right? Where were people, like, were they writing or were they just drinking beer and dancing, right? And you find that even the recent history that happens, right, is that like we are prone to believe the false thesis that they are providing to us, as if what they have written was not contested or it was not invented. I think we need to problematize the concept of evidence. What do we mean by evidence? Is it an exhibit, or is it a display, or is it a source? So like we need to confront those reports every day, and it's good that we should take that responsibility, as you are saying, but we need to raise fundamental questions.
Gosh, I also think I want to like sort of contribute to the question of like how we conceptualize the sort of like discussion and debate we're having. And for me, it's around, because I know like in the type of scholarship that I like to do, I like to think of it as something that, you know, these debates among Africans, when we talk about like talking back, you know, like writing back to the empire, talking back, etc. And doing the kind of scholarship that even while we talk back, we do not like sort of center or re-entrench the position of the colonial and the empirical in the kind of scholarship that we do. So it's just like, then I'm curious, because these are some of the debates that I'm constantly coming across. You do like such a brilliant project at like sort of then thinking through Mfecane as like, you know, not something that exists in the pre-colonial, but as part and parcel, I guess, of, you know, what happens as part of this modernist project. But I wonder if we were to like sort of flip the script and sort of like occupy a third space where not necessarily we conceptual or think through of Mfecane as something that exists in the pre-colonial as an alibi, but also not Mfecane as part and parcel of a colonial project. So in the third space, in terms of what happens when we think of it, and I guess maybe I can like sort of borrow from the sorts of debates that happen in Nigeria around, you know, the colonial experience as an epoch or just a moment. What happens when we think of the colonial then just as a moment? I mean, acknowledging obviously its brutality, etc., but also acknowledging that Africans do have a history that predates the colonial and will outlive the colonial. Then what sort of lens or what sort of approach do we then adopt to think of Mfecane? Are there any significant changes, or do we still have the same outcome that like continues to center the colonial in that like sort of discourse?
I don't know how to respond to these ones. But there's something called timidity in historical writing. Timidity is always to suspend your own conclusions and your own terminologies. And here I played that role specifically. I put the word formations to avoid something else. But at the end of the day, a paper needs to be written. You will need to name. You will need to name. I will name, but I won't name now. I'm still thinking deeply about what names to use. As I already indicated, that the easiest way out is for people to vernacularize. That doesn't help much. It's a step towards resolving the naming issue, but it doesn't resolve it completely conceptually. So it's important to then think deeply about what forms of naming. And that actually takes me to your question about why am I talking about mobility, migration. Again, I was trying to make this distinction that mobility needs to carry that issue of voluntary movement. Migration tends to speak more of being pushed. That was, I was trying to make that distinction. And again, I'm not sure whether it makes sense, but I thought it was important to throw it here. The empty lens issue, that's why I was saying, colonial thought is very resistant to evidence. You can go to the work of Colin Bundy, which proves beyond doubt the areas which were said to be empty. And it names the people who were there. You can go to the work of Norman Etherington. It also speaks about the same thing. And I'm not sure whether this Afro Forum deliberately ignore that evidence. I'm yet to read the report and see what happens. But it goes back to what Story was saying. You use the same people who want to propagate the idea of empty lands as evidence, as the source of evidence, including their members. This is where we have a major problem about the history of Mfecane. The James Stewart Archive, which is one of the sources. Who was James Stewart? Why was he recording what he was recording? What was he leaving out? So the problem is like using a thief's narrative to prove that I did not steal. So it's a bit of a very problematic argument in terms of what is the evidence itself. Because the written evidence is written by the same people who are already involved in the problem which we are talking about. So that becomes very, very confusing. But, you know, historians are always very modest. They are not like political scientists who will come forcefully. Historians, like lawyers, who are always driven by evidence. Yeah. So when you have no enough evidence, you make propositions, then you hold your horses. And that's what I was trying to do today. But I will move beyond that.
Colleagues, let's give Sabelo your lecture has left us with a lot to think about. And we'll do that, and hopefully we'll contribute to the debates, to the scholarship. And thank you very much, colleagues, for coming. I just thought I should say two things. Because you have a paper, and I've seen it. If colleagues can fill in the register, the attendance register, and with the permission of the professor here, who will circulate his paper, so that you can read. Those who have not signed, if you can do that, then tomorrow we'll circulate the paper so that you can read even more.
And if there is more feedback, I'll be happy to.
Yes. And secondly, we have a couple of events for some of you may be interested. My colleagues have told me that I should inform you that on the 23rd of April, there is another lecture by Professor Romain Murenzi, who is the president of the World Academy of Sciences. He will be here to give a lecture at the same time at 5 about the role of science in developing countries. Then on the 25th, we will have a lecture by Professor Petri Vaisesenen, who is an astronomer, who will be coming to talk about gravitational waves. Sounds exciting. I'm looking forward to it. And then Professor John Ripley, who is a visiting fellow here, will give a lecture on the 7th. On the 24th, there will be a seminar by our own Dr. Anthea here will talk about race and racism in South Africa. And then on the 14th of May, there will be a book launch on urban inequality in Johannesburg by Dr. Melissa Miambo. And we'll have a lecture on the 22nd by a professor here at the University of Johannesburg. We'll be talking about the new charismatic churches and why in the era of the fourth industrial revolution, congregants are following these charismatic church leaders. So that is the program for April as well as for May. And thank you very much. And for those of you who have not had the refreshments, we are welcome to have them. And if some of you want to come and give an extra here, let me know. We will provide you with a platform to sit personally.
Hey.